Hello everyone. In this penultimate lecture of the course, we will be exploring immigration to Europe and the subsequent rise of right-wing nationalism that it inspired. Much of the rise of right-wing politics can be explicitly linked to immigration and fears of national or even racial extinction. Following the Second World War and the massive loss of life that occurred in it, there was a mass shortage of labour in Europe. In particular, young men, the traditional workers in an industrial economy, had been killed or maimed in great numbers. This was particularly a problem in Britain and Germany. In order to rapidly restore the European economies, it was necessary to import labourers from abroad. Britain, France, and Belgium looked to solve their labour shortages by encouraging immigration from their colonial empires. Germany and Austria looked for workers in the European south, particularly Spain, Italy, and Turkey, countries which had a surplus of workers. Limited exchanges also took place between the countries of the Soviet bloc. Before 1962, any immigrants coming from Britain's former colonies, now known as the Commonwealth, could enter and stay in the UK for as long as they wanted to. Tens of thousands of Indians immigrated to the UK, especially in the 1960s. Many times, these new arrivals did not come from India itself, but from Africa, where they had been moved by the British during the years of the Empire. In Uganda, for example, dictator Idi Amin decided on a whim to expel 50,000 Indians from his country in 1972, and most of these came to the UK. Many Pakistanis and Bangladeshis also immigrated to Britain, settling in the West Midlands and the North, just as Indians had settled in London and the East Midlands. Today, there are 1.4 million British Indians in the country, and many have become affluent, with Indians having the highest wages and lowest poverty rates of any ethnic group in the country. Black people from the Caribbean and Africa had lived in small numbers in Britain for many years. During the Second World War, the influx of hundreds of thousands of African American GIs and Caribbean RAF pilots into the country gave many white Britons their first chance to meet and interact with a black person, despite the fact that the British Empire ruled over millions of black subjects worldwide. Mass Caribbean immigration to Britain is normally regarded as beginning with the British Nationality Act in 1948, which allowed for the 800 million subjects in the British Empire to live and work in the UK without needing a visa. The symbol of this new policy was the arrival of the migrant ship, the Empire Windrush, into the port city of Tilbury in 1948. 150,000 Caribbean people subsequently moved to the UK in the rest of the 1950s, settling mostly in London. Caribbean people were mostly looking for job opportunities, often in the newly established National Health Service, but many also had a cultural attachment to Britain and were hurt by the hostile reaction that they experienced whilst in the country. This hostile reaction began as early as 1948, when 11 MPs, the British version of congressmen, wrote to Prime Minister Clement Attlee complaining about excessive immigration. What is interesting was that these MPs, like the Prime Minister, were socialists and were appealing on behalf of British workers. This signified the beginning of a change in British politics, where working class people would start looking to the traditional enemy, the Conservatives, to answer their anxieties regarding immigration. Migrants faced discrimination from white Britons over housing, which was in extremely short supply due to the German bombing raids in the war. A racist organization, the White Defense League, was founded in 1957 and began attacking black and Indian people, especially in Caribbean areas of London, such as the West London district of Notting Hill. In 1958, the Notting Hill race riots saw a mob of 300 to 400 white people attacking the homes of black Londoners for an entire week. The police response was feeble, and many black Londoners were arrested for merely trying to defend themselves. Perhaps the most infamous example of anti-immigrant sentiment in 1960s Britain was the so-called Rivers of Blood speech by conservative politician Enoch Powell. This speech was made as a hostile response to a new law to prevent race discrimination. Powell argued that immigrants to Britain should be encouraged to migrate due to the fact that they had not integrated in society and made white British people feel ill at ease and out of place in their own homeland. He warned of an upcoming crisis that would occur if immigration was allowed to continue. The explicitly racial nature of Powell's speech shocked British politics and led to him becoming a pariah at the same time as it generated huge amounts of popular support, even helping the Conservatives to win the 1970 election. In the 1970s, jobs suddenly became scarce as the economy contracted. This helped the rise of the far-right movement, the National Front, which had many working-class supporters and even recruited from soccer grounds, and led to violence in the streets between the NF and anti-fascists. France's losses during the First World War had meant that the country had imported thousands of labourers during the interwar period, mostly from southern and eastern Europe. Many of these immigrants were, however, then sent to their original countries after completing short-term work contracts. Following the Second World War, many loyalist Catholic Vietnamese moved to France after the country pulled out of Vietnam, fearing persecution from the victorious communists. Although South Vietnam was not conquered until 1975, many Vietnamese felt uncertain about moving to the country as it was an unstable dictatorship under constant attack from the north, as the US was to find out. Algerians who supported the French, whether white Christians or Arab Muslims, also fled to France following the Algerian War. Pro-independence Algerians also moved to France. These were targeted by the police themselves in the 1961 Paris massacre, during which between 100 to 300 Algerians were killed. The vast majority of immigrants to France moved to the cities, resulting in the growth of working-class immigrant neighborhoods. Nicknamed banlieues, which was originally the word for suburbs in general, these neighborhoods became poverty traps, where immigrants were isolated from the rest of French society, both socially and physically. Moreover, immigrants were expected to follow French social norms and integrate to a greater extent than in Britain, a country which had a less clearly defined national identity than France. This, alongside a concurrent collapse in employment rates in the 1970s, led to extreme tensions about the threat to both French and immigrant identity, a version of the cultural wars as seen in the US. French far-right parties received at their height about 30% of the public support, but have yet to come to full power in the country. Meanwhile, tensions continue, as seen in the recent clashes between migrants and police in the wake of terrorist attacks in the country. West Germany was in chaos after the Second World War, with refugees flocking into the country from the east. Some of these refugees fled Poland or Czechoslovakia, both of which had looked to expel their German minorities, and some fled from East Germany due to the harsh government restrictions and deprivations of food and goods there. At the same time, the complete destruction of many German cities meant that there were very few houses to place people, and refugee camps sprang up everywhere. There were, however, lots of jobs, especially in coal mining and manufacturing. The German economy, backed by US loans, began to boom, and soon, even with the refugees from the east, there began to be a shortage of workers. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, the German government signed a series of agreements with poorer countries such as Greece, Turkey, and Yugoslavia. Under the terms of these agreements, workers from these countries could move to Germany to work in the factories and mines on short-term contracts. It was then understood that these workers, known as Gastarbeiter or guest workers, were to return to their countries of origin. Turkish workers quickly became the largest immigrant group to Germany, with figures in both countries concerned that the workers were not returning home after their contracts. The agreement between Germany and Turkey came to an end in 1972, but still most Turks stayed in Germany. The German government went so far as to pay workers to return, but millions remained. The East Germans themselves imported thousands of workers from socialist countries abroad. Referring to these workers as "friends", the government contrasted its supposed embrace of Vietnamese, Mozambicans and Cubans to the West German government's supposedly cold-hearted capitalist calculation. Nonetheless, the residency of foreign workers, who often received the worst jobs, in East Germany was also always designed to be temporary. Workers from abroad were often attacked by local East Germans due to disputes over wages and women, etc. These incidents were hushed up by the government, which did not want its facade of friendship to break down. The German far right was somewhat subdued during the Cold War due to recent memory of the Nazi years and Hitler's failure. Nonetheless, in both Germanys, it regained confidence and presence during the economic downturn of the 1970s and 1980s. German unification in 1990 led to a surge in nationalist sentiment amongst Germans who were proud that their country was whole once more. However, the early years of the 1990s saw a number of vicious attacks against helpless immigrant communities, particularly in former East Germany. In 1991, there were 849 hate crimes, and in 1992 there were 1,485. From August 22nd to August 24th, 1992, violent riots took place in Rostock, in the former East Germany. Stones and petrol bombs were thrown at an apartment block known as the Sunflower House, where refugees lived. At the height of the riots, several hundred militant right-wing extremists were involved, and about 3,000 onlookers stood by, with some applauding. As we have seen, the fleeing of Balkan refugees from the Yugoslav wars created a surge of opposition that saw right-wing parties do well in elections in Austria and Switzerland. Likewise, the accession of former Warsaw Pact countries into the EU did much the same in the UK and the Netherlands. As we shall examine in the next lecture, this was an important factor in the rise of the Brexit movement in Britain. In my hometown, Harlow in Essex, a middle-aged Polish man was recently murdered in a xenophobic attack. In the countries of Eastern Europe themselves, however, immigrants and immigration was discouraged. Countries such as Bulgaria continued to deter immigration even as their populations shrank. This was due to a resurgence in national pride after years of suppression under communism. The ongoing war in Syria created a wave of immigration as Syrians desperately fled their country for safer conditions for their families. In June 2011, Turkey received the first of millions of refugees that were to pass into and through that country. Syrians then began to migrate by sea the following year, landing in Italy and the Greek islands. A concurrent influx of refugees from Libya created what is known as the European migrant crisis. The worst year of this crisis was 2015, during which over 1 million refugees arrived in Europe. The different European countries squabbled over their responses. Some put up barriers, others facilitated the movement of refugees but to different parts of Europe. Germany, taking the lead, ended up housing 1.3 million refugees, half of the combined total. Germany subsequently saw the growth of the right-wing Alternative for Germany party, which argued in favour of a Germany First policy that was not so self-sacrificing. Mired in scandals over the level to which the party is racist or politically extremist, AfD, as they have known, have nonetheless performed well in recent elections, although they have been unable to shake the political hold of Angela Merkel and her grand coalition over the country. Elsewhere, the right experienced limited success in Italy and failure in France. At the same time, it has strengthened in Poland and Hungary and had remarkable success in utilising anti-immigrant sentiment in the 2016 EU referendum in the UK. Indeed, it is tempting to see Brexit as an entirely anti-immigration issue, as we shall discuss in the next lecture.